Margaret has a kind and gentle soul, which made her a natural animal lover. Wherever she went, she always developed a special bond with the animals she met. But the one animal that holds a special place in her heart was her pet, an African gray parrot named Charlie. Charlie has been a huge part of her life for over 50 years, but Margaret had no idea how much she meant to Charlie until the day they had to part ways for good. Before we continue, please take some time to subscribe to Dailydose, like, and share this video with your friends. Margaret owned Charlie when she was just 20 years old. It all started when Margaret was solo traveling in Greece. There, she met her husband Jack, who was also traveling solo. They clicked and decided to travel together for the rest of the trip. One day, while they were driving along a back road, they almost ran over a small gray parrot. The young African gray parrot looked very hungry and dehydrated. It was so small, and Margaret thinks the mother had abandoned it. Margaret and Jack immediately took the parrot to a vet. She could not bear to leave the bird just like that, so she did everything she can so that she could take the parrot home with her, and that was how she owned Charlie. Jack could not stop thinking about Margaret and the kindness she showed Charlie. He visited her and they started dating. It did not take long for them to get married. Charlie became their ring bearer. When Jack died, Charlie started to become more than just a pet for her. Charlie was her constant companion and the main source of joy in her life. Charlie offered her comfort and support whenever Margaret needed it, and he has been a faithful companion to her. But then, just a few years after Jack's death, Margaret's health started to decline. She later found out that she had cancer. Despite this, Margaret tried to be positive and cherish the precious time she had left with Charlie. It did not take long for the news to spread about Margaret's situation. Margaret and Charlie were a popular pair in their town, and people sympathized with her. They knew Margaret had no kids and Charlie was all she had. Because of that, they allowed Margaret to bring Charlie inside their stores and restaurants. Eventually, Margaret got weaker. Her hair became thinner and started falling off. Every move she made was painful. She started going out less. At this point, Margaret knew she could no longer take care of Charlie. She was starting to feel guilty because Charlie deserved a lot of love and care. She knew she had to make a difficult decision soon. She started looking for options for Charlie's next home. As the days passed, Margaret's condition was getting worse. She made the decision to enter hospice care even though she knew she would not be able to bring Charlie with her this time. This was the heartbreaking moment when they must separate. Several months later, Margaret found herself thinking fondly of Charlie. She remembered the day she first brought him home. He was barely a year old then, a scrawny and anxious bird, but he has grown up to be a very smart and beautiful friend over the years. Margaret smiled at the thought of all the love and joy she shared with Charlie. Sarah, the head of the hospice, noticed Margaret smiling. In her line of work, it was very rare to see patients smiling, so it was a refreshing sight. Sarah approached Margaret and commented that she looked cheerful. Sarah asked her what she was smiling about. Margaret told her she was thinking about her beloved pet and how much she misses her parrot. Sarah had no idea that Margaret owned a parrot and that it was a pet that meant so much to her. Sarah tucked Margaret in bed as she asked more questions. Margaret had a lot of charming stories about Charlie, and Sarah was immediately invested in their relationship. Sarah listened to Margaret's stories every time she was free. As the days went by, Sarah and Margaret's friendship became stronger. They sat together in the afternoons after Margaret goes on her daily walks to chat. Their friendship made Margaret feel less lonely. When Margaret was not responding to the treatment, she decided to stop her chemotherapy so that she could enjoy her last months. But even without the treatment, she was in pain most of the time. Despite all this, Margaret was a fighter, and she was determined to hold on to life as long as she can. But she knew she was running out of time soon. She suddenly started wishing that she would be able to see Charlie one last time. Margaret expressed her last wish to Sarah. Sarah was hesitant at first. They had entertained requests like this before, but it was usually for cats and dogs. A bird may be a different case. But Sarah promised Margaret that she would do everything she can, but she can't make any promises. Deep inside, Sarah knew she would do anything to make this possible for Margaret. She knew how much Charlie means to her. First, Sarah had to do some detailed research on whether birds could spread dangerous diseases. She did not want to compromise the health of the other hospice patients. As soon as she determined it was safe, Sarah had to track down where Charlie was. Margaret told her she handed Charlie over to a bird rescue center. The Bird Rescue Center assured Margaret that Charlie would be able to fly freely and would be loved and cared for under their care, but it was a sanctuary that was out of town. Meanwhile, Margaret's health was declining rapidly. She was unable to get out of bed now and was put on around-the-clock care. Sarah knew there was not much time left. She could only pray that Margaret could hold on until Charlie got to the hospice. When Charlie finally arrived, the parrot was screeching very loudly out in the parking lot. You can tell he was not happy about being transferred again. Perhaps the poor thing had been traumatized the time Margaret gave him away. But as they entered the building, Charlie became suddenly quiet. It was as if Charlie knew Margaret was nearby. The parrot kept looking around him like he was searching for her. When they neared Margaret's room, he started to get excited and started to screech again. Margaret opened her eyes to the familiar sound of Charlie screeching. At first, she thought she had only imagined it. Maybe she was missing Charlie so much that she was hearing things now. A tear rolled down her cheek as she thought of it. But then the door to her room opened and Margaret gasped. She could not believe it. Charlie started screeching nonstop when he saw Margaret, that it was very loud, but it all sounded like music to Margaret's ears. They released Charlie from his enclosure, and the parrot immediately flew to Margaret's side. You can tell that both of them were very happy to see each other. It was a very beautiful moment, and almost everyone had tears in their eyes. Margaret looked over to where Sarah was standing and whispered, "Thank you." Sarah stepped forward and told her that everyone in the room helped to fulfill her last wish. Margaret smiled at everyone and thanked them as well. Margaret started telling Charlie all the things she wanted to say. To everyone's amusement, they could see that the parrot was listening to her attentively as if he understood everything she said. And it was not only that. It seemed like the parrot knew Margaret was not feeling well. Charlie kept cuddling her and kept his head close to hers. He kept looking nervously at the people from the bird center as if he was nervous that they would take him away from her. After a few hours, Margaret fell asleep and Charlie also fell asleep in her arms. The bird center staff told Sarah that it was time for Charlie to go. Sarah knew separating the two would be difficult, but they had no choice. Margaret knew this was the last time she would see Charlie. She tried her best to fight back her tears and look strong, but it was a difficult moment for her. Everyone's hearts broke as they witnessed the final goodbye between Margaret and Charlie. But suddenly Margaret calmed down. If this was her last memory, she knew she would be okay with it. She felt at peace with everything. Margaret gave Charlie one last kiss on the head and signaled the bird center staff to come over with the enclosure. Margaret gently placed Charlie back in the cage. Charlie seemed to realize that Margaret was saying goodbye. To everyone's surprise, Charlie said, "I love you." Margaret gasped and looked at Charlie in shock. Those were the first words he uttered ever since she met him. She had waited her whole life for Charlie to start speaking, but although he was an intelligent parrot, he never did get to learn to talk. Margaret was overwhelmed with emotion when she heard Charlie's first words. "I love you too, Charlie, so much," she whispered.